Imagine the absolute peak of human power. You are the Lord's anointed, a monarch whose empire spans multiple continents. In your domains, as it was then sincerely believed, the sun never sets. At your disposal are millions of submissive subjects, invincible armadas, and the divine right to execute, pardon, and wage epochal wars. You are the living embodiment of the state itself. Now imagine this demigod in a heavy ermine mantle, pacing nervously across a cold stone hall, awaiting an audience with a man who holds no title, no ancient lineage, and not a single armed soldier. Waiting with bated breath, simply to ask his permission to launch the next military campaign. How did it happen that a man who owned half the world became the disenfranchised hostage of someone who owned merely a stack of scribbled ledgers? We have been taught for centuries that history is a majestic chessboard of kings, ambitious emperors, and brilliant generals. From our school days, we diligently memorize the dates of great battles, learn the names of extinguished dynasties, and genuinely believe that the borders of nations were drawn exclusively by the tips of cavalry sabers and soldiers' bayonets. But if you look closely through the centuries into the dense shadows behind the royal thrones, you will see the real, tightly drawn strings pulled by entirely different people. There is a hidden, shadow layer of history, a layer where crowns were bought on credit, great armies were sold to the highest bidder, and invincible empires crumbled simply because one man in a modest velvet doublet decided to dryly snap his ledger shut. To understand how this hidden power was formed, we need to go down to the very origins of this deadly game between the sword and the purse. The 14th century, Europe stands on the brink of the 100 Years' War. In 1339, the young and incredibly ambitious English king Edward III decides that the crown of France must belong to him. He has superb archers, steel-clad chivalric cavalry, and an absolute, unshakable belief in his own righteousness. But he has one fatal problem. He doesn't have a single shilling. War is a bottomless pit that devours resources at a terrifying speed. And so Edward turns his gaze south, to Italy. At this moment, the true masters of the European economy were the Florentine banking houses, the Bardi and the Peruzzi. They were the financial leviathans of their time, whose agents sat in every major city in Europe. The English monarch comes to them with an outstretched hand and borrows an astronomical sum for those times, about 1.5 million gold florins. To make the Florentines trust him, Edward III does the unthinkable. He leaves the very crown of England as collateral to the moneylenders, and even pawns the Archbishop of Canterbury. The bankers, blinded by the interest rates and promises of trade monopolies on English wool, open their vaults. But here, the first historical turning point occurs. In 1343, Edward III realizes that there will be no quick victory in France. The debt has grown to the heavens. There is nothing to pay with. And the king makes a decision logical for a man with an army. He simply declares a default. He refuses to pay. The monarch decided that the power of the sword was greater than the power of the promissory note. The consequences were catastrophic. The houses of Bardi and Peruzzi collapsed, triggering the first pan-European financial crisis in history. The savings of thousands of people evaporated. The economy of Florence was destroyed. The king won a tactical victory, crushing his creditors. But he didn't suspect that this lesson would change the rules of the game forever. The financial world learned one brutal truth. Trusting the word of a king is deadly dangerous. A monarch shouldn't just be given credit. A monarch must be bound hand and foot. Less than 2 centuries pass, and we see an entirely different picture. the 16th century, the golden era of absolute rulers. By early 1519, Charles V Habsburg is preparing to become the most powerful man on the planet. Under his rule are Spain, Naples, the Netherlands, colossal German territories, and the newly discovered, fabulously wealthy lands of the Americas. His Spanish tercios, professional infantry, strike terror throughout Europe. It seems his will is the only law. Kings issue decrees, fleets plow the oceans. Such is the grand, dazzling facade. But behind this facade hides that same dirty, pragmatic detail. To become the Holy Roman Emperor in that same year of 1519, Charles simply needed to buy the votes of the prince-electors, the 7 men who chose the emperor. The price of the issue was known in advance and was non-negotiable: 850,000 florins, a sum so colossal that it could instantly bankrupt a couple of mid-sized European kingdoms. And the invincible Charles did not have this money. The ruler of half the world was as poor as a church mouse. The imperial crown was already preparing to sail away to his main rival, the French king Francis I, unless Charles could find someone to buy this title for him. High politics had finally given way to high finance. The fate of the greatest empire was now reduced to a simple financial transaction. The question of power was no longer decided by blood on the battlefield. Now, capital decided everything. The fate of the entire European continent hung in the balance. The crown of the Holy Roman Empire had become just another commodity, a commodity that could be bought simply by signing a contract. The throne rooms of monarchs were looking more and more like banking houses, and state secrets were now hidden within heavy ledger books. The destinies of nations were determined by promissory notes and debts. Dry numbers on paper became more important than ancient noble titles. The influence of any monarch was now measured exclusively in gold, and the fate of Charles V, as well as his election as emperor, now depended entirely on one single man. A man without a crown, a man who didn't command a single armed soldier, but who possessed a hidden, absolute power: the control over money, the control over the credit of all Europe, and therefore the control over the fate of kings themselves. And here, Jakob Fugger enters the historical stage, a banker from the German city of Augsburg. Not a nobleman, not a commander, not a cardinal, just a man with a cold, calculating mind. He understood earlier than anyone else that money is the circulatory system of any state, and that a gold ducat always beats a steel sword. Fugger didn't just lend Charles money, like the naive Florentines once did. He organized a highly complex financial transfer of 543,000 florins. Essentially, he just bought the imperial throne, buying the greatest power on the planet for the Habsburgs. But Fugger's favor was no royal gift based on a word of honor. The illusion of chivalry shattered. It was a ruthless investment, an investment with very hard collateral. In exchange for the crown of the empire, Fugger demanded something much more real. He received an absolute monopoly on the mining of silver and copper across all of Central Europe. The banker took the real subsoil wealth in exchange for a beautiful political title. Thus, the new mechanism of hidden power began to turn. The old order was definitively broken. Now, finance dictated terms right on the battlefields. The massive armies of the emperor were paid straight out of Fugger's pocket. The ships sailing to the New World were outfitted exclusively on the German banker's credit. By 1523, things had gone so far that Jakob Fugger wrote a letter to Emperor Charles V. It was a letter the likes of which history had never known. It contained not a single trace of the usual royal subservience. The banker dryly reprimanded the monarch like a petty clerk. He bluntly reminded the emperor of his unpaid debts. "It is well known to everyone," Fugger wrote, "that without my help, your majesty could not have obtained the Roman crown." The ruler of half the world was completely dependent. Fugger demanded the immediate repayment of the loan, and he wanted all of his interest paid in hard coin. The emperor, before whom multi-thousand-strong armies trembled, silently swallowed this profound humiliation. He had no choice but to sign over yet more state revenues to the banker. Another piece of parchment sealed his financial fate. The mechanism of absolute control was fully set in motion, and it quickly proved to be utterly ruthless. War no longer depended on the bravery of noble knights. The brilliance of military strategists faded into the background. Modern war demanded massive armies of mercenaries, and those mercenaries demanded hard cash every single month. But only the creditors held the heavy bags of coins. If the banker in Augsburg said no, the distant army simply dropped its weapons. Or, much worse, they turned around to loot their own employer. This is exactly what happened in May of 1527. The imperial troops of Charles V mutinied after months without pay. Maddened by hunger and a thirst for plunder, the soldiers broke into Rome. They staged a massacre the Eternal City had not seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. The army commander, Charles de Bourbon, was killed in the first minutes of the assault, and the rogue mercenaries took Pope Clement VII hostage. The greatest political crisis of 16th century Europe had begun. It happened not because of an enemy's cunning military plan. It happened entirely because of a delay in a credit tranche. Mercenaries don't care about the greatness of an empire or its sacred goals. They only care about where their gold is. By the middle of the century, the stakes skyrocketed even higher. The Spanish Empire seemed to be an endless generator of absolute wealth. High in the mountains of South America, the Potosi mines were discovered. It was the largest silver deposit in human history. Entire silver fleets, loaded with bullion, stretched towards European ports. In 1556, broken by endless debts, Charles V abdicated the throne. His son, Philip II, inherited this vast empire. Rivers of precious metal flowed directly into the Spanish treasury. It seemed that now, finally, the monarch would be truly independent. But the reality was exactly the opposite. The American silver legally didn't even belong to Spain. It was already pledged to Genoese bankers, pledged before the heavy galleons even had time to leave Havana. The Genoese financiers had smoothly replaced the German Fuggers, and they introduced an entirely new, ruthless credit system. This new system relied on asientos, complex loan contracts, and shady deals. The interest rates were astronomical, bleeding the empire dry with every signature. Spain, the world's superpower, had become nothing more than a desperate, chronic debtor. The crown was now hopelessly hooked on the needle of eternal credit. Philip II continued to wage his endless, draining wars across the globe, but the entire financial structure began to crack under the impossible pressure. In 1557, the inevitable happened, the first state bankruptcy. By 1575, it happened again, shattering any remaining illusions of stability. Yet the creditors remained calm, cold, and utterly unmoved by the royal crisis. It was the chilling, calculated logic of the bankers at work. With a single stroke of a pen, the golden flow of money simply stopped. Accounts were frozen, leaving the king's treasury hollow and silent. Transfers were halted, and the machinery of the empire ground to a halt. Without its lifeblood of cash, the Spanish Empire began to suffocate. The pride of the nation, its legendary army, began to rapidly degrade. Discipline vanished as the promise of pay became a lie. Loyalty, once bought with gold, dissolved into thin air. Hunger turned to rage as the soldiers' stomachs went empty. The consequences were destined to be written in blood. Spanish fury was unleashed, and it didn't spare its own territory. Antwerp, the crown jewel of trade, was set ablaze by its own defenders. The wealthiest city in the north was systematically dismantled by greed and desperation. Thousands perished in a nightmare of fire and steel. Antwerp lay in ruins, a smoking monument to financial failure. The world's economic heart stopped beating. Markets and warehouses stood empty. The bankers now held total leverage, forcing the king to his knees. The army was a wild beast, completely out of anyone's control. A city destroyed by the very soldiers meant to protect it. The collapse of the trade hub left only silence and ash. Defeated, the king was forced to sign documents admitting he could no longer pay. The reality of power was no longer found in palaces, but in the flames of the streets. Ash and embers were the only dividend left for the empire. Behind closed doors, the bankers began to analyze these costly mistakes. The fall of Spain became the ultimate textbook lesson for high finance. They realized the immense risk of lending to a single volatile ruler. Even the mightiest monarch proved to be too dangerous a liability for the banks. A royal crash triggered a chain reaction that threatened the lenders themselves. If the state falls, it can take the banks down into the abyss with it. A new, more sophisticated symbiosis between state and bank was required. The search for a more stable financial weapon had begun. They needed a model of control that didn't depend on a king's whim. The banker had to rise above the conflict entirely. The strategy shifted to a more profitable path, financing every side at once. Money began to flow into opposing armies, ensuring the banker always won. Time moved forward into the dawn of the 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars erupted, setting all of Europe on fire once again. But the scale of warfare had reached a terrifying new level. The days of small, manageable professional armies were over. This was the birth of total war. Millions of soldiers now marched across the vast fields of slaughter. War had become a financial black hole, a bottomless pit that devoured every available resource. This new scale of conflict swallowed entire national budgets in a matter of months. Immense wealth, gathered over decades, simply vanished into the smoke of the battlefield. At the center of this storm stood Napoleon, a man of iron will and cold calculation. He understood better than anyone that war must feed war. His strategy was simple: seize territories, drain their resources, and exploit the land to keep the machine moving. But as empires exhausted themselves, their allies were forced to look for a different kind of survival. They needed more than just soldiers. They needed a relentless flow of credit to stay in the fight. A coalition of nations emerged, bound together by a desperate need for gold. And so an endless stream of money began to pump life into the weary Allied armies. This was the moment the Rothschild family stepped into the heart of global events. They weren't just bankers, they were a financial ghost network, faster than any government and more agile than any army. Nathan Rothschild emerged as the mastermind. Nathan Rothschild as a mastermind. By 1814, he took full control. His brothers were in different cities, a global information network. Fast Rothschild agents and couriers outrun government messengers. Wellington's army is stuck in Spain. French pressure, the front line is strained. Exhausted soldiers without food or money. The collapse of army morale. Gold in London, but inaccessible to the front. The blockade of Europe, blocked routes. The campaign on the brink of failure. The cause of defeat? Logistics. Nathan Rothschild appears as a key figure. He takes the situation under his control. A plan on the map of Europe, Rothschild's brothers in different cities, secret purchase of gold, buying gold in France, money inside the enemy system, corruption and forged documents, money moving through Europe, crossing borders and mountains, delivering gold to Spain, transferring gold to Wellington's army. The paradox, the enemy financing the enemy. The financial system as a weapon, cannons with gold. Napoleon does not notice the threat. Victory is decided by finance, generals and bankers, the contrast. 1815, the tension is rising. Battle of Waterloo, the roar of cannons, the clash of empires on the battlefield. The stock exchange in London is frozen and waiting. The fate of Britain depends on the messenger. If Napoleon wins, the economy will collapse. Nathan Rothschild is waiting for the news. His private boat crosses the English Channel in a storm. Rothschild receives the news first. Wellington has won. Napoleon is defeated. Nathan enters the stock exchange with a gloomy face. He starts selling government bonds. Panic on the market. Everyone is selling. People think the British have lost. The prices of bonds hit the bottom. At the last second, Nathan buys everything for pennies. The official news of the victory arrives. The market explodes. Rothschild becomes legendary. One man made a fortune on a single piece of news. The era of the banker, as the real king, has begun. The influence of the Rothschild house spread across the entire continent like an invisible web. They didn't just lend money, they dictated the terms of peace and the price of war. No major state project could move forward without their silent approval. The era of the Industrial Revolution demanded unprecedented amounts of capital. Railway lines began to cut across Europe, fueled by the gold of the great banking houses. Factories rose from the ground, their smoke marking the beginning of a new age of production. The stock market became the new battlefield where fortunes were made and empires were broken. Old aristocrats watched in horror as their titles lost value against the rising power of liquid cash. A new elite was born, one that didn't care about bloodlines or ancient coats of arms. Power was now measured in compound interest and credit ratings. In the shadows of the Great Exhibition, the bankers calculated the future of global trade. Telegraph lines began to transmit financial data across oceans in seconds. The world was shrinking, becoming a single interconnected market controlled from London and Paris. Governments became increasingly dependent on international loans to maintain their standing. Tax systems were redesigned to ensure the steady repayment of massive national debts. The central bank emerged as the ultimate guardian of economic stability, or the ultimate tool of control. Revolutions shook the streets of European capitals, but the banks remained untouched and secure. Even in times of chaos, the ledger remained the only absolute truth. Behind every political movement, a financial trail led back to the same vaulted rooms. The gold standard became the universal language of the civilized world. A single currency system, anchored in precious metal, ensured that the rules of the game remained the same for everyone. But beneath this surface of order, new tensions were beginning to boil. Colonial expansions into Africa and Asia required even more financing, driving the stakes to a breaking point. The great game was no longer just about territory, it was about the monopoly of resources. The sunset of the 19th century brought an uneasy peace, bought and paid for by the creditors. Huge dreadnoughts were launched, their steel hulls paid for by multi-generational bonds. The machinery of destruction was reaching a level that no single nation could truly afford. The bankers knew that the next great conflict would be the ultimate test of their system. They prepared for the inevitable, knowing that whoever won the war, the interest would still be paid. The stage was set for a century of unprecedented debt and global transformation. The shadows of the 19th century faded, giving way to a much darker and louder era. The sound of gears was replaced by the sound of sirens. The first cracks appeared in the old world order. No one could stop the momentum of the machine. The age of the absolute banker was at its peak. The gold standard was the final seal of their power. A world tied by debt is a world that can be managed. But the costs of the new century were rising faster than the mines could produce gold. The credit system was stretched to its limit. Behind the scenes, the ledger was being rewritten. The old dynasties prepared for the coming storm, knowing that chaos is the best time for profit. The roar of the 20th century was approaching, turning the page of history once again. Empires were about to bleed, but the debt would remain immortal. The transition was beginning from the power of the land to the power of the numbers. A digital future born in the vaults of the past. The game was changing, but the players stayed the same. The old foundations of Europe began to crumble. Paper money replaced the weight of gold. Inflation became the new invisible tax. The war for the future had just begun. Central banks took over the steering wheel, no longer hidden, but part of the state. The global debt reached into the trillions, a number no human could truly comprehend. Every citizen was now part of the ledger, born into a system they never chose. Wealth shifted from hands to screens. The algorithm became the new king. Control was no longer about walls and borders. It was about the flow of information and credit. The invisible hand was now a digital one. Constant monitoring of every transaction. The ultimate dream of the early bankers. A world perfectly calculated and owned. There was no escape from the network. History is written by the winners, but it is financed by those who remain in the dark. The ledger is never closed. The interest is always due.